Well, hello and welcome to today's Advanced OSHA Reporting and Record Keeping Workshop. I hope that you're in for an interactive experience because that is exactly what we've designed today to be. So we've got lots of case studies. We'll have lots of stories. You can even begin by putting in your own stories. If you have some great OSHA stories that you want to share within our webinar community here, you can go ahead and start by putting those in the chat. In case we haven't met, my name is Holly Foxworth. I'm a registered nurse, and I'm also the marketing manager for content. You're going to meet our team shortly, but before we get started, let me get you an introduction and kind of give you some surroundings on what you're looking at there on the webinar platform. So the first place I want you to look is on the far right-hand side of your screen. You should see a large purple box, and there should be a small one below that in blue that says RSVP. So do yourself a favor, go ahead and select the RSVP button because starting in April, we're going to kick off a full quarter of all things mental health. And so we're going to have Dr. Les Curte. He's our Senior Vice President of Behavioral Health Services. He's going to be leading those. And the first one that we're going to go through is first response and mental health strategies for crisis intervention. So I don't know whether you've ever found yourself in one of those scenarios where you're faced with a crisis, but you're stuck with, what do I say? What do I do? What do I not say? As many times as I've been through some of these trainings, even as a nurse, I learn something every single time. I know that you guys will as well. So if you go ahead and press that button, that will make for sure that you get registered for that event. You don't have to enter any additional information, and we know that you're going to enjoy being there. As always, we will record these and we'll make this session available to you on demand within 24 hours. Second thing I wanted to tell you was that there's several things I wanted to ask for that you can really help us with. The first is on the bottom of your screen, you should see some emojis that are there. We use those for several reasons. It's not just to push a button. It's to tell us that something is interesting to you. Does it get your attention? Is it important to you? And so the way that we use those is it creates a capture clip. And so we share those. So if it's important to you, it's obviously probably important to your colleagues as well. And so we want to make for sure that we can share those. The other location that I want you to become familiar with is that Q&A chat box that we talked about. That is the first place that I go to whenever it comes to creating and sending out gifts after this event. So we want to hear all of those great questions, and that is exactly where we want to go there. Let's go ahead and start with our introductions, and then Dr. Cherry, we'll start with you first, and then we'll follow that with Dara.
Well, thank you, Holly. My name is Scott Cherry. I'm Axiom Medical's Chief Medical Officer. I am board certified in preventive medicine, public health, and occupational environmental medicine. And I've been supporting industry, the government, and military for the past 15 years. And it's a pleasure to be with you.
Fantastic, Dr. Cherry. Thank you for joining us today. Dara?
Thank you, Holly. Hi, everybody. My name is Dara Wheeler. I'm Axiom's Chief Marketing Officer. And I have to say, although I know a lot of you are very passionate about safety in OSHA, this is definitely one of my favorite topics. And I love working through some of these scenarios with Dr. Cherry because I always learn something new about OSHA and recordability through these conversations.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to have a great time. So definitely going to be an interactive event. First poll question that we're going to put up is on a scale of 1 to 5, how confident are you in determining OSHA recordability according to what those OSHA standards would be? So let's say if 1 was, maybe I have some questions, and 5 being, I wrote the book on OSHA, I should be an OSHA inspector. Just kind of give us a viewpoint of where we're starting from. There's no wrong answers here. We'll go through some of these later on, but this gives us an idea of where we're starting from. And we want, by the time that we complete this event, that we can move those confidence levels up. In terms of what we're going to be going through today, the first is key concepts and recent updates. So Dr. Cherry is going to take us through this. We're going to go through some of the recent updates that have occurred. There's been a lot of changes that have happened, and then we want to prepare you for this upcoming year. The second part is it recordable? And that's where you're going to have a great time. We've got some great scenarios that are there. That's where we want you to share yours as well, and we'll all go through it together as a group. We'll follow that by streamlining and reporting some of the record keeping processes there. We'll give you some ideas on how you can improve that, and then we'll also take in the avoiding some of the common pitfalls. So Dr. Cherry, we'll start with you and talk to us about some of the recent updates that are there.
Yeah, and I think we've just eclipsed the 2023 submission deadline And so now is really a great time to focus forward and pivot to look at how we can strategically incorporate improved processes and reporting and record keeping with these new requirements. In fact, 2023 saw the largest number of inspections since about 2015, with over 34,000 inspections. Historically, OSHA is mostly a very passive mechanism for where most employers are not going to be inspected. But I know with some of these changes with funding, it's looking to be much more active versus passive in this inspection process. I believe in 2024, there's going to be almost 20% increase in funding with over 400 new full-time employees to rebuild and strengthen the enforcement component of OSHA. I rotated through OSHA as a medical resident, and the medical department's actually quite small. I think it's probably 5 to 10 docs, but there's maybe hundreds to thousand or so enforcement officers. So it's really an enforcement agency, but it does have a medical department itself. And so really, looking forward at 2024, the goal of the changes for record keeping is to increase transparency and improve tracking of workplace injuries through electronic submission, with both OSHA and MSHA ramping up, again, inspections and setting new precedents. So, the new requirements really, if we, look at it now, it's expanded electronic submission requirements, with 100 plus employees with certain high hazard industries. Those industries will be required to submit detailed information on the OSHA 300 form, and as well as the 301 injury and illness incident report, in addition to the 300A summary. So for those of you that actually fill these forms out, you'll know exactly, you're very familiar with these types of forms, but some things to definitely be particular with, because this data will be transparent to the general population. So you really want to make sure there's privacy considerations, and especially avoid personal identifiable information, which employee addresses and things like that on the form 300 and 301. This data is going to be there's going to be publication of this data, which means employees and potential employees can make this information, or access this information publicly and make decisions based on workplace health and safety records. So really, in some ways, this puts the reputation of the health and safety culture of the company on the line. And excuse me, I think right now with the new requirements, there's probably over 50,000 different employers out there that will now have this new requirement.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Cherry, then when we're talking about transparency and tracking, then the transparency piece seems to be a common theme that we're hearing about. Do you think that that's going to be what really is pushing us into 2024 as we move forward?
Correct. And, I think there was very slow mechanisms to maybe get this information through, like a FOIA, Freedom of Information request, or maybe there's a complaint through the hotline. So it's much clunkier, a lot more inefficient process. So this is going to essentially be probably a queryable, data feed similar to what we see with, Bureau of Labor and Statistics or the Department of Labor, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Steve Rainey had asked, so the injury lawyers would be able to see names and possibly contact injured employees if the names are listed. You had covered that when you were talking about publication, some of that data and some of the privacy concerns. What type of information should be protected that you wouldn't include on those types of forms?
Yeah, so what we look at in medicine is any pieces of information that can single out someone. So obviously name, date of birth, social security number, employee number. it should be very vague information to where people cannot identify an individual out of the population.
And so would the idea be then for the transparency piece that then the general public would be able to access this information and make some decisions? Then could be potential employees that are looking at employers. It could be your competitors. How wide do you see this spanning?
Well, I guess in the last decade, I think there's these websites for potential employees to, like Indeed, or Dara may be able to help me. I know she tracks this also quite closely.
Like Glassdoor.
Yeah.
Glassdoor, you can kind of have employers reviewed by current and past employees. And so if you're working in a physically demanding and hazardous work environment, the safety culture of the company really probably matters to those folks. And so it could make the difference between, being able to get enough employees, for your company or not, if it really becomes if it stands out compared to its peers.
Going back to Steve's question, do you think that we will see increased liability by some of this being so transparent and being public?
So there's no personally identifiable information disclosed, but if the companies are basically identified, then there can be some reverse engineering about what locations and where to focus marketing and certain efforts, right? So I think the purpose of OSHA is to protect the health and safety of the employees. Sometimes there's unintended consequences, right? But I think this should motivate us and clients out there to have really good systems and processes in place to make sure that their logs are accurate, which we'll talk about more later, but really to embrace health and safety from that primary prevention, if at all possible.
Carrie had asked a great question, was asking about using gender pronouns in the injury descriptions, like their hand or their back. So what would you advise on that?
Could you repeat that first part, Holly, again?
Yeah, they were asking about gender pronouns, using gender pronouns in the injury descriptions.
Okay. I would probably leave out, gender pronouns. Unless there's a specific instruction that requires it, but that would be, to a degree identifiable depending on how small the population is for that company.
Yeah, good points. Good points. Excellent. The other question I was going to ask you was specifically about some of the data that is here. Do you think that we will see some of the trends, that we'll see some safety improvement trends just because the simple fact that people are looking all of a sudden?
I think it will be helpful in many ways. If there's a number of certain natures of injuries, like it may actually allow companies to query this to see about solutions or where to market their efforts, right? Or product development. I think the first order effect is a company going to be penalized, right? But I think all the secondary and tertiary effects will be employees can kind of look and see how their company's doing. The companies can see how they're doing, and may set for better benchmarking. No data set is perfect, but I think this being the first year or couple years, whenever there's a new, whenever we look at data, if there's always a change in the methodology, then those years are always significantly different than the previous years. But we will start seeing trends eventually.
Absolutely. And do you think that we will continue to see an increase in inspections that come along with this?
It seems like that, with the increased hiring and funding, and OSHA does seem to be the person that leads OSHA is a political appointee. I actually was literally rotating there when there was a change in the presidency from one party to the next, and the shift in the culture and leadership at OSHA, was very different from one month to the next. So it was a very powerful experience for me to see that over a couple of months period.
Mm-hmm. It looked like that even some of the MSHA inspections had increased this last year. They're really trying their best to put that foot forward about not only having the inspections, but also putting the information out. Not that it's a scare tactic, but I mean, it definitely does raise some eyebrows, that's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to want to lump MSHA with OSHA, but, they're kind of like siblings, but, there's similarities, but then there's big differences in some of the requirements. So I always have to really, dealing with MSHA, I always have to make sure I second and third check some of the things I have to deal with, but they're siblings. They definitely have similarities between them.
I agree. Well, let's get into the fun part here. We'll get into some of the OSHA recordable pieces here, but just to kind of give you an idea of where we are and where your peers are that are joining you here on the event, it looks like that everybody's kind of within that 3 and 4 range. So we have some that are just kind of starting out, and then we have some that are very advanced. So thank you for that input. That gives us an idea of where we need to take the conversation and move forward. Dara, I'm going to turn it over to you as we open up to our interactive session here with some of these questions. And again, I want to reiterate, if you have a great OSHA story, you have a great story about what is recordable, or you have a question, maybe you're dealing with something right now, put that in the chat and we'll go through it individually and talk about it, but also share with the group and talk that through with you. So Dara, I'll turn it over to you for the scenarios.
Great. Thank you, Holly. I'm going to describe the scenario and then let Dr. Cherry talk us through how he would think about this. Holly gave us some tricky ones, so make sure you're paying attention.
Dara, I forgot before you start that, I forgot to say we're going to give gifts. So whoever answers this correctly, the first one to answer it correctly gets a gift. We'll follow up with you in the email. So make for sure that you're in that chat bot and you're answering, do you think that this is recordable or not, as she goes through the scenario. All right, Dara.
Okay, let's jump in. So we've got a 47-year-old male employee who has scratched his middle finger on a vinyl saw clamp at work. He immediately began walking to the on-site first aid station to obtain a Band-Aid. On the way, the injured employee met a coworker who told him that he had a Band-Aid in his pocket. As the coworker began to apply the Band-Aid, the injured employee looked at his finger where there was a small amount of blood on the skin adjacent to the nail bed. The worker immediately became lightheaded and fainted. The injured worker did not incur any additional injury or treatment. When he regained consciousness, the employee indicated that he fainted because he cannot tolerate seeing blood. Is it recordable? So what do we think? Everybody needs to weigh in. Is this a recordable injury? We got some people coming in with some answers.
People are coming in, yeah. I tell you what, why don't we have Dr. Cherry go through the explanation and then we'll announce who the winner is. I see that we've got some that are in here.
Yeah, and maybe I'll slow roll it because I know people are still wanting to input a little bit. So, and there's some general framework, right? So when we're thinking about an OSHA recordable injury, kind of the first kind of layer would be, is it work related, right? So is the injury work related or the illness work related? And, that can have some nuance to it. And then I like to think of it as the administrative component of the injury. So, if there's like a fatality, obviously that dramatically just straight goes to like OSHA recordability and, immediate report, days away from work, restricted work, transfer. I think what we get involved with a ton is medical treatment beyond first aid. So, I think our expertise in our incident case management is obviously keeping the appropriate injuries at what OSHA defines as first aid. And so that's a very specific list. So anything that's not on that list is then considered medical treatment beyond first aid. And even very minor injuries can, if they're not managed appropriately, can quickly go into medical treatment beyond first aid, so that you've, bought yourself a OSHA recordable, which probably shouldn't have been. But if enough time has passed, then we can kind of dip into this one. So, just kind of from a gut feel, if someone scratches their index finger, it's not like a significant injury, because there is kind of this potential wording about if it's just a significant injury, it should be OSHA recordable, but that's a lot of discretion with the with that type of injury. So scratch middle finger, went to the first aid to get a Band-Aid. And so again, medical treatment beyond first aid, or the OSHA guidelines do allow for a Band-Aid, right? It does not allow for like suturing or staples, but so we're good there. Looks like a coworker's helping out. So everything's looking pretty good, right? There's nothing so far that I've seen that will eclipse that threshold. Applying the Band-Aid, the injured employee looked at the finger, saw some blood. So here's kind of the twist, right? So it's a minor injury. Looks like it's not going to be medical treatment beyond first aid because it's just a Band-Aid. It's not like a deep cut or anything like that. But as soon as the worker fainted, that invokes kind of the administrative, really, there's no discretion there. And, this would be categorized as a OSHA recordable just because of loss of consciousness at the work site because of a work-related exposure. So, again, this is a fairly interesting one because it has many components to it.
Dr. Cherry, you're absolutely right, and we've had a lot of good answers that have been coming in here. I believe that Blanca Dorsey was the first one that gave the right answer, that had said that yes, it was recordable, and then several have followed up, and they caught it very quickly and said that yes, it was because of the loss of consciousness that that was made recordable. Yeah.
This one I feel is extra tricky, right? Because when you read between the lines of the OSHA recordability guidelines, they're looking for things that are really hurting people, right? So fatality, loss of consciousness, like a blow to the head, or anything that's causing someone to change their status at work, like days away from work, transfer, restricted work. So this one, it's a little bit like gray zone, but not gray zone, right? So, in some ways, I think what this scenario speaks to me is have kind of more professional assistance or process, right? Like you want to have whoever's doing the safety first aid, like they need to be maybe trained, right? So if there's any type of cut or laceration, like have that person sitting down. When I was in internal medicine, I think the definition, you couldn't technically, I guess you could faint while you're sitting, but there's probably a little bit more prep about, hey, there's blood here. Are you okay? Don't look at it, things like that. Guys usually are pretty bad about that. They say they're okay, and then they pass out 2 steps away from the blood donation, but
Marcus was asking, what if there was a secondary injury?
So the loss of consciousness, invokes it immediately to OSHA recordability. But I would say now, if you're worried about like compensability, my medical opinion, just in this hypothetical scenario, would be it would be also covered, right? So if someone hits their head and then gets a traumatic brain injury and, a very complicated, messy claim, right? Like, slips, trips, and falls are usually the most common, but more straightforward. But, hitting your head is, can kind of cause it can be a much more complicated matter to manage.
Absolutely. Anna was asking, although let's see, no other injury was incurred. And so is it your position that the reason that this is recordable is solely because of the loss of consciousness there?
Correct.
Yeah. The other, let's see, it looked like that Chris was asking, how do I put the input? Chris, just the way that you put that question in, just put it right there in that box where you put the question, and that gets it to us. So you're doing great there.
And Dr. Cherry, your point about compensability is interesting too, because of the degrees that we think of OSHA recordable status. There's this treatment beyond first aid, And this scenario, the loss of consciousness already kind of elevates it to that recordable status. But I think when we think about it, there are degrees of almost like more negative outcomes from an OSHA standpoint. There's the lost time status, or there's obviously fatality, and it continues. So I think in a scenario like this, it's not just managing the scenario that's in front of you, it's trying to manage not just the compensability, but the work status. If that employee, we make sure that employee is okay, even though it is treatment beyond first aid, sort of, it's that weird gray area. And it does become recordable. We just, at that point, really want to make sure we're managing status. Can we get that employee safely back to work? What does that look like? Making sure that we manage the next steps of that process, so that when that employee goes home and tells their spouse, hey, I passed out at work today, that they have resources and know who to go to in that situation with questions and with different situations where they don't then go to the emergency room that night to talk about the loss of consciousness, when we can help manage that process more appropriately.
Right. You know, and in some ways, I feel like our clients know this, or those, you know, on here now, but because we help so many different clients, we have so many interactions that perhaps, you know, some of the folks on here are kind of siloed. So if they're on the safety side, they may not see the risk side very much. But, you know, from our viewpoint, we see a lot of things crossing both departments. And so I've seen like claims that are workers comp compensable, but not OSHA recordable, and then vice versa, something that's actually OSHA recordable but not compensable in the workers' comp system. And so in general, they should be correlated, right? Like a more severe injury should probably be compensable and OSHA recordable, and the opposite, right? But I've seen it go every which way. So my take home point is having a really good process to manage injuries at the earliest ability to have the best outcome. And that should really optimize both workers' comp and OSHA recordability.
Absolutely. One more good question that came in before we get to the next scenario. It was Jeremiah that was asking, does it change anything if the person that provided the first aid was to faint?
You know, so I think that's a new person getting injured, right? Yeah. And I've thought about this a lot, and I've supported a lot of chemical companies and oil and gas. So like people can pass out from, you know, seeing blood, but they could also pass out from a odorless toxic gas in the environment, or, you know, something like CO2 displacing oxygen. So, you know, if it's an office setting, it's a little different than if it's like, you know, a heavily industrial setting, right? And they just don't want things slipping through the cracks of, oh, yeah, people seem to scratch their finger and faint because of blood in this one part of the refinery, but it's actually something else leaking, you know? So I think that's been my gut about these rules, you know?
Absolutely. Okay, let's see. You ready to go on to the next one? Are you guys ready? Ready to put your answers in? Okay, here we go. Dara?
Okay, another tricky one from Ms. Holly here. Okay, we got a 26-year-old male employee who cut his hand while sharpening a personal pocket knife. He was sitting in a company-owned vehicle while parked in the employer's parking lot, but was on a lunch break. As the incident occurred while on his lunch break, the employee drove himself to the local urgent care where he received 3 stitches. Is this recordable? We'll pause there for a second. I know the way Holly is thinking, there's definitely some tricky things here. And it kind of goes back to what Scott was talking about the difference between compensability and OSHA recordable. So I'm going to just keep rambling and let you all guess. Got a lot of you jumping in. Okay, Dr. Cherry, what do you think?
Talk us through it.
Yeah, like you definitely have to kind of have like a process to go through this, right? So, all right, well, 26-year-old male cut his hand. So this could be a pretty deep cut, or it could be a very minor cut. Personal pocket knife. So that kind of gives me a question like, oh, is this against policy, right? Because it's a personal pocket knife at work. And then, sitting in company vehicle while parked in the employer's parking lot on lunch break, right? So, a lot of the questions can be like, is lunch break considered personal? Because he's, sharpening his, personal knife, but he's not in his personal vehicle. And then the other twist is, he got 3 stitches. So if it's a minor cut, um, even if it's minor, 3 stitches would invoke OSHA recordability immediately. If it was just like steri strips, then it potentially wouldn't be. But so again, he went medical treatment beyond first aid. So the main thing is this work related or not? And sometimes, or a lot of these cases actually should have a multidisciplinary panel with like HR, safety, medical, and risk to say like, and legal, I guess, that legal/risk, where, the lawyers will sometimes really know the rules about what's considered work related or not based on some of the legal nuance. But, here this person was at work during assigned working hours, and he was in an employer-owned vehicle. So that really kind of, whatever the employee's doing in that vehicle is essentially the employer kind of owns that component of it. And so, again, this is I would say a work-related injury that received medical treatment beyond first aid. So it is OSHA recordable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Cheryl, you were the one that got that. You were the first one that got that one correct. I think that some of the questions that I've seen that are rolling in through here is that there's a struggle about that. It's personal hygiene. It falls into the personal hygiene piece because, you're dealing with your own knife, and if they were cleaning up their nail or whatever it was that they were doing with that. But you're exactly right, Dr. Cherry, about bringing that back to, even though on their lunch break, and Cheryl pointed that out, that not only would it be recordable, but it would also fall under work comp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think to Scott's point about the nuance and getting the panel together, multidisciplinary panel, there are definitely going to be scenarios where people might not be reporting this on their OSHA logs. And so it's always best, when you work on those multidisciplinary panels, to make sure you've got consensus and you've got an approach that is consistent. I think if you end up getting challenged on an approach like that, as long as there's a standard that you're applying and you can documentation in these scenarios is so critical. Holly as a nurse knows that if we don't document, it didn't happen. And so it's all about how you document from the minute this occurs and on at an organization. So often, if there was ever a question and you go back, you have that initial documentation of the rationale and what the thought process was for that kind of scenario.
Yeah. There was a lot of questions about, Dr. Cherry, about would it make a difference? It seems like that we're seeing a lot that are asking questions about, is it just because they were on a lunch break? And then there's also some that are asking about, is it because if it was a personal vehicle, would that change anything? Do you have anything that you want to add there about the lunch break piece?
I think in some of these aspects, legal would probably be the best to respond, but I know there's nuance. Like, for instance, if someone's on a lunch break and they're participating in a wellness program, like if they get injured during kind of like a fitness benefit, I'm trying to draw back from my previous experiences, but I'm trying to actually remember now. It's been a little bit, but there is nuance if it's like if it's voluntary or versus mandatory. But I think if it's in a personal car, there's probably more of a gray area, and there's more room for the panel to go in the sense of this was truly personal time. I think once you're in a when you're in a company vehicle, I think that whole time you're there, it's considered you're basically, working officially. So it's very it's very it's a little bit it's less gray, so to speak,
Yeah.
versus if he was in a personal car. Yeah.
This also brings up a point about recording and reporting in general. The piece that I added in there about that, they drove themselves, they didn't inform the supervisor, and they drove themselves to the urgent care clinic. That is a piece that some are bringing up as well. And we see that on our end about that, something is not reported to a supervisor. And the question is always, if it's not reported to a supervisor, does that mean that it's still recordable? Do you want to go into any of the reporting pieces of that?
Yeah. So, I think this is a great example of having really strong policies, but a culture that, is driven to all employees about how to handle work-related injuries, because employees can kind of take the initiative and go to like an emergency room where the chances of them getting maybe over treated is very high, even for a minor injury. And so really the best practices we've seen over our years is early reporting, reporting to the supervisor. That way, the best approach can be really managed. This one really screams to me concerning because, using your own knife at work is usually not a good thing from what I've seen in, the industries we support. It's usually very professional where if you need anything for work, it should be an official tool or things like that. So, this one, which, companies that are kind of in that gray zone of allowing employees to, kind of go seek care without reporting in timely fashion. I think with this transparency and recording and reporting, they're going to show up in poor favor, I think,
Yeah. Scott had said, and I appreciate you saying this, Scott. Scott said we entered an interpretation to OSHA where we had two employees pull into the parking lot in the morning, got into a fight, and one of the employees broke their arm. They hadn't even clocked yet, but OSHA responded that within their interpretation that it was recordable because they were on company property.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen a case where, yes, someone was. It was before work. They were in the parking lot though and tripped, and so it was deemed work related. So then it'll potentially go into depending the severity, right? Recordable and then compensable.
Yeah. Yeah. Tom had said that we had a situation where an employee slipped on ice and injured their back in the company parking lot before their shift started and was asking, would that be a work claim or more of a liability issue?
That's a good one, actually. And I'm not a lawyer, but I bet a lawyer would like that to be more of a workers' comp claim just because it probably limits the liability. But again, I would be the medical aspect on this board with everyone else on there, but my gut would be it would be considered work-related and workers' comp.
Yeah. Let's see. So many responses and good stories that are coming in. This is fantastic. There was questions about if it was a public parking lot, would that change the outcome?
I believe so. If it's a personal car. If it's a company car, I think that's where, there's a lot of, I guess it's a lot of risk, but yeah, whatever the employee is doing in that company car, it's going to be work related, and the company is going to be responsible the whole time.
Yeah, there's one more that came in, and Carol was asking that they had an incident where an employee was in the company cafeteria on lunch break and had fallen. And so she was asking, would that be recordable? That's a tricky one too.
Yes. Again, I would still use the that panel just, because I think HR and legal has a lot of probably a stronger voice in this than medical, but my gut would be it is considered work-related. But that would probably be better answered through probably one of the other panel members.
Yeah. Okay, are you guys ready? You ready to go to our third one?
Yep.
Okay, let's do it. Dara, I'll let you have this one.
Okay, we're about to hit summer, so got our heat-related scenario here. We've got a 34-year-old female employee delivering customer packages on her routine route. Temperature that day was 81. She developed a headache, muscle aches, and nausea, notified her supervisor, who assumed she was suffering from a heat-related illness, advised her to seek medical attention. When evaluated, the employee had a blood sugar of 330 and was treated with IV fluids and insulin. The employee later disclosed she was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes several years prior, but had not been under the care of a physician. Is this recordable?
Ooh, we're getting some good answers.
Got lots of people.
Let's see, make sure I got the first one. Crystal. Okay, we've got some good answers that are coming in. I've seen a right one. Do you want to go through this with us, Dr. Cherry?
Certainly. And, of the three scenarios, like this is, I think, the most, it's my favorite, but it's my favorite because it's truly what medical can provide on these types of assessments. And so this is truly like a medical, heavy in medical expertise here. And so, okay, we have a 34-year-old female employee delivering packages en route, temperature 81, and then started getting some symptoms that, it could be anything, right? Headache, muscle aches, nausea. I mean, we're post-COVID, so everyone knows that could be COVID, right? Or it could be something else. So assuming it's heat-related illness, but it looks like her boss said, "Hey, go seek medical attention. You're not doing well," and that was really a great call. And so looks like her blood sugar was really, really high. So for the audience, normal blood sugar fast, if you're not eating, is less than 100. But even if you had like a huge meal, your blood sugar should be like between 140 to 180. It shouldn't be, within 2 hours of eating, it should get below 140. So 330 is significantly high and definitely a concern for diabetes. That high of a blood sugar will definitely make you symptomatic. And so, this employee later disclosed she was diagnosed with diabetes before, but hadn't, been under the care for it. So, the first administrative thing we think about is it work related or not? So this is really a personal medical condition that really wasn't exacerbated by the work environment or exposure. It's really just personal. So, it's kind of an easy one, but I think it's easy only because we do this every day. But for those that aren't in the medical field, but it could look like, some kind of something, it happened. Just because it happens at work doesn't mean it's work related. And, this is some of the more rewarding work we do is, advising when things are truly not work related because it's personal in nature. It's not about covering things up or anything like that. It's having the appropriate assessment to say, oh, this is clearly, a chronic medical condition,
Absolutely. Jonathan pointed out that he agrees with you, Dr. Cherry, on the board plan. Said I'm a 20-year safety medic now in safety management, and they always run it through their HR and legal departments before they finalize to put the verification on their interpretation there. Excellent points.
Yes.
The first one that got it right was Kevin Newman. So congratulations, Kevin. You were the first one that was there, but there's lots of questions here that have came in that are related to this. So first we had the heat element that you talked about. And so normally you would always think that it would be recordable because of the heat element. And especially once you throw in that they were given IV fluids and some insulin. So we had some that were going in that direction. We're thinking maybe it would be recordable for that reason. But then you pointed out the personal medical condition and how that can impact. Do you see some of these, Dr. Cherry? Have you seen some particular cases where you've reviewed them from a medical perspective and been able to kind of save them on their OSHA reporting log there, just because it may appear that it's recordable, but that in fact could be that of a personal nature?
Yeah, and just like what someone was saying in the comments, if this person's blood sugar was not so elevated, if it was more normal, if it wasn't a clear diagnosis of exacerbation of diabetes, it could be considered a heat illness. And then if they're getting IV fluids, it would be beyond. One of the list is you can give oral rehydration, right, like Gatorade or electrolytes, and so it wouldn't be treatment beyond first aid. But this one, it would be, right. So, but it can expand to almost any chronic medical condition. High blood pressure can cause a really bad headache, right? And so the blood sugar is normal, but if the blood pressure is, quite high and then they have a headache, that's really a concern, right? They need to get treatment immediately. But if you don't check the blood pressure, and then usually with a heat stress illness, usually the blood pressure is getting lower, but it can be a little bit complicated. But, even like heart attacks, right? If someone has a heart attack at work, you might have a presumption that, it's work related, but actually only, I think, firefighters and maybe police officers have that presumption of cardiovascular coverage, right? So any firefighter who has heart disease or a heart attack, it's considered work related by rule. But heart disease usually takes years and years to accumulate, and it's usually not from a work environment. It's usually just personal in nature, right? But someone might think, it happened at work, but it's usually manifesting at work, not from an actual exposure.
Dr. Cherry, Oswaldo had asked a question, brought up a good point he was asking about, but can the heat trigger a medical condition if they had diabetes? Do you want to talk about some of the implications that they may be at risk if they had diabetes and how heat can impact that?
Repeat that first part again, Holly, sorry.
Yeah, he was asking, even though it's not recordable, could the heat trigger an existing medical condition?
It could. It could, right? So heat will lead to dehydration. So it could exacerbate diabetes. It could cause some, chest pain or heart issues if someone had so it can be very nuanced, right? Like it really depends on the specific facts, but could cause gout. So heat stress is very prevalent in occupational medicine and occupational safety. So really trying to prevent heat stress is critical. But I think it would still be a judgment call from the panel, right? So if this was the case, it's really quite clear this person hasn't been on treatment for, ever really. So it's probably reasonable that's what created it. And there's actually some labs you can do to see about dehydration in this workup too. So you would know actually if it was dehydration as part of this clinical scenario or if it was just high blood sugar.
And Linda was asking, is 81 too hot?
So this is super interesting. And I think, I don't think it's just me. I think Dara geeks out on this too. But when we do heat stress every year, it's more and more interesting, right? So we've actually seen data now where people actually manifest their heat stress on the coolest day of the week. So it's a new employee starts or in a new area and it's like really hot Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Thursday and Friday it's cooled off. But heat stress is cumulative. So like you might be 10% dehydrated after day one and then another 5% dehydrated, and then it actually cools off, but you've never really fully recovered through appropriate rehydration, or your body still needs to be work hardened with this new work or the new environment. And so people sometimes will manifest on the coolest day of the week, but it's a cumulative stress, Yeah, 81 also depends on humidity. And so temperature alone is a little bit misleading. Like in the military, we use wet bulb globe temperature. So it can be sneaky how to figure that out. But 81, it depends on the type of work you're doing too.
Very true. Very true. Kevin had asked how important is it to disclose to the employer the medical condition? And if you don't disclose to the employer, is it still recordable? Would something be recordable?
Yeah, so the way we work is, and the way I've specifically done things is, you disclose minimum necessary. That's what the legal has always advised me. And so in general, I will report feel confident this is a personal injury that caused this. And then I have my own notes that are separate from, so not just anyone can access them, right? But they're there if it's challenged or if there needs to be, recall, things like that. But sometimes depending on the company and their legal department, they want more disclosed. And as long as it's minimal necessary and to just the right people that have to sign off on this, I feel that that's appropriate. But having everyone in the company know is really not the right answer, right? Or the supervisor sometimes, it cuts both ways,
Absolutely. Jonathan had mentioned that NIOSH has a good infographic available for heat-related illness that was relating to the question. So good point. Yeah, we appreciate that. All right, let's move on this. We can keep it moving here. It looks like we've got about 8 minutes left. Let's talk about streamlined reporting and record keeping process. How is it that we manage that? What tools can we
I think, me or Daryl, you said?
Either one is fine. Yeah, if you want to start, Derek can add in as well.
I didn't want to steal her thunder. I might have mistaken it. Yeah.
No, go ahead, Scott.
Okay. Sorry about that. When we look at this in totality, I think it's more important than ever to get record keeping correct. And it's always important to have a process, a standardized process in place by which every injury is treated fairly and without kind of undue, bias and things like that. And so having a technology that really is tracking injuries and giving you trends about, where you may be having an outbreak or cluster of issues is really key. And as well as automation of timely notification, follow-up, record keeping, and then having, audits that allow for, sometimes someone outside the loop that actually can give new color into what's happening within the organization. Sometimes corporate will audit different business units and vice versa. And then really just educating, all of the different stakeholders on really the importance of appropriate, injury management. What's the policy? If something's going awry, how do we escalate and really, we do a lot of education here, and it seems like you can't over-educate, right? But you need to have that balance of if too much may actually kind of lose people's attention. But I think for work-related injuries, especially if you have a significant amount of them, education is really the primary tool you have to where it may help you the most in rooting out the root cause issues.
Absolutely. Dara, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's well said. I do think it's an interesting balance. And I do think that one of the areas that Dr. Cherry and I have thought a lot about recently is the benefit cycle of the culture of being able to feel confident that when you do report, even if it's a near miss, that it's taken appropriately and seriously at your organization. And I think, there's been a lot of buzz. Psychological safety has been around for a really long time, but it's definitely circled up this last few years as a really important concept. And I think employers that take psychological safety seriously and create that kind of culture, it ends up kind of begetting better reporting and better communication within the organization, so that you start preventing injuries in a different way, so that when people feel comfortable reporting minor injuries and there's no fear of retaliation and there's this environment that allows for that, then what you start to see is that everybody becomes committed to safety. It's not the safety person's responsibility to be committed to safety. It's the whole organization's commitment. I know most of our audience, I'm kind of speaking to the choir here, but I do think what we're starting to see is when you really dedicate the effort to that kind of culture building, the numbers start to really play out. And so that's become really interesting when we see that shift from a company that maybe only reported maybe to us more serious injuries, and then start reporting, sometimes people feel, oh, I'm just reporting that dumb paper cut again. Well, that culture of reporting the dumb paper cut again prevents issues downstream, because people feel really supported. If they can report the paper cut, then they can report the laceration that's more serious. And then you end up really supporting the company culture in a new way.
Absolutely. Jared, we talked about some of the things we were talking about even this last week in the public case of the West trial, where you had the armor that Alec Baldwin was involved in, et cetera, and OSHA came out and said that a lot of things came down to pre-work, allowing for pre-work specifications and allowing for time for some of those things. What other types of scenarios then would you see where looking at a proactive approach would make a difference?
Yeah, I think Dr. Cherry said it well. We tend to nerd out about this stuff a little bit. He might geek out. I'm nerding out about it. And I do think that when we think about these areas of looking at how we can get into the prevention and understanding the data modeling in a way that looking at things like fatigue and mental health as a component of injury, I think is really exciting. Axiom screens for both on a regular basis post-injury. And the hope is we can start moving more and more upstream. Axiom is in this early component of the process, but we want to even get ahead of that, because we're working here post-injury. So if we can go upstream from the injury and start thinking about this in different ways, thinking about how employees are showing up to work with the total worker health approach has been around for a really long time, but that concept of that whole person showing up for work is really important, with the amount of sleep they've had, the amount of hydration and nutrition they've had that day, and then their ability to show up for work in a healthy state. And what that means is so critical. So we're going to keep geeking out about it, and you'll hear more from us in coming days on some of this.
Absolutely.
Dr. Cherry, what do you think?
Yeah, no, that's well said there. I don't think I can add anything to it. We definitely are kind of, I'm actually questioning if nerding out or geeking out is what I need to be doing.
Well, as we go into this last section, we definitely want to cover how it is that you can avoid some of these common pitfalls. So Dr. Cherry, I'll look to you on this one and talk to us about where people seem to fall through the cracks here on getting too much OSHA attention that they don't need.
And we covered this a little bit about misclassifying injuries. And so this is that administrative aspect I was telling you about. So once something is considered work-related, then you think about, is this medical treatment beyond first aid? Is this restricted work? Is this lost work time? And so I think, you know, every company is going to have a policy about how to handle worker limitations versus even accommodating any type of work, right? So that's where you have restricted work or lost work time. But I think really one of the biggest things that will make a big difference is, you know, optimizing your process for injury management that really maximizes the first aid treatments that OSHA defines. Because if your system and process doesn't you know, identify you know, a way to ensure that your injured employees are getting the right amount of care at the right time, they can quickly go beyond first aid, right? And so it's OSHA recordable when really not needed. So it's almost like a false positive to your reporting. So it has all kinds of unintended consequences. So if you have a bunch of minor injuries that actually are bleeding into OSHA recordability, it's misleading everyone. You're paying higher, you know, insurer rates and things like that. You may not be able to bid for work. And so, like, for those that aren't in highly safety sensitive industries, then they might just think, well, it's just a log and it doesn't really affect our ability to work like it does in oil and gas or some other safety critical industries. So why not just over report? And so I think now with this transparency, the company may, you know, it can just be actually YouTubers now looking for content, right? It's like, oh, look at who's every year the report will probably be available, right? So it's probably kind of fodder for that. But, you know, more importantly, it may actually flag, you know, an OSHA inspection, right? So they're definitely gonna, they're not gonna inspect everyone every year, but they're probably gonna inspect people that have higher than average, you know, injury rates and things like that. So you don't necessarily want to be too cavalier and just saying, well, let's default everything into being recordable. So yeah. And go ahead.
Well, Dr. Cherry and Dara, both, I appreciate you both. And you guys have been a fantastic audience today in the webinar. You submitted so many questions and so many responses. This has been fantastic. It looks like I have a lot of gifts to give out. So I'll be following up with some of you individually that are there. But we appreciate you again. If you haven't already, make for sure that you do press that RSVP button, and we would look forward to seeing you this next month. Thank you again.